to episode 78 of the How to Japanese podcast. I'm Daniel Morales. It's July 2026. Otsukare-sama deshita. We made it. This month, I'll be doing something a little bit different on the podcast. I'll be starting with my review of the JLPT N5, which I took earlier this month in Osaka. And then I'll be getting into the standard agenda of the podcast that most listeners will be familiar with. So I wanted to do this just in case anyone interested in my JLPT thoughts was not interested in the rest of the podcast. So I thought I'd put that at the beginning of the pod. And for anyone else, you can go ahead and fast forward through it. I will go ahead and start with the thoughts that I recorded immediately after taking the test that I just recorded on my iPhone. So I'll jump to that in just a second. And then after that, I'll put down a few thoughts that I've had after that. So this will just be about 8 minutes. The audio quality won't be quite as good because I recorded it on iPhone headphones while I was walking from the station to my apartment in the rain in Osaka right after the test. So here are those thoughts. I just finished taking the JLPT N5 in July of 2026 here in Osaka. I am walking home from the station back to my apartment, so I've got about 10 minutes or so, and I wanted to kind of get down some immediate thoughts before I lose them. Maybe this doesn't even need to be said, but the JLPT is not a pleasant experience in 2026. It's extremely rigid. They're really strict. They really don't provide much guidance at all. They yell constantly, don't touch your electronics that are in an envelope, and you can't open it. And all these instructions are in Japanese, and the people there are at the N5 level, so they can't understand all the instructions. And so, like, at the very end, they have this very complicated instruction where you're suddenly, the whole time you've been instructed not to touch the envelope, and then they tell you you can touch the envelope, but just to put it on your desk, and then they check that it hasn't been opened, and then you can open it. So I imagine this is all in response to a rash of cheating that must have happened at some point between when I last took it 20 years ago and now, or they just need to crack down and be stricter to maintain the integrity of the test or something like that. But it was just very strict, not really a fun time. That said, the test itself, N5, I was impressed with. You need a serious level of Japanese to pass that test. You cannot study for 2 months and expect to pass the JLPT N5, or even 3 months, to be honest. You need a full ability of Japanese, being able to read and decipher and listen to Japanese. Obviously, you don't need to speak it for the test, but being able to speak it would probably help you on the test. I was very impressed. I went in expecting to think it was pretty easy, but I came away being very impressed and thinking that I probably could not have passed it after 1 year of study. I think I probably would have been still a little bit too early, although I took my first year of Japanese in an intensive course over the summer, so that might have something to do with how I felt about after I finished my first academic year of Japanese, which was really just over a summer. What else? So there's 3 sections just to kind of go over it. You're not supposed to share specific test questions, but I think it's well known that there are 3 sections: a vocab section, a grammar section, and then a listening section. There really aren't that many questions total. There are about 20 in each of the first 2 sections, maybe 22 in each of the first 2 sections, and then 23 in the final listening section. So you really could knock it out a lot faster than the way they do it, although that's assuming it's a very easy test for you. They do think they could shave off a little bit of the time, maybe just by reducing the break time. The thing that I would emphasize to people who haven't taken the JLPT yet, or just going into the JLPT, is you need to have your logistics down in terms of you need to know where the testing location is. You need to have pencils ready and an eraser ready. You're not allowed to have a wrapper on your eraser. You need to take it off. You're not allowed to have the lead for the pencils. You have to have that already loaded. You can't have the case for the lead. You need to know how to get to the location. I got there today and there was a huge line, but that was only because the elevator wait was a long time. And so I would say, don't expect to show up right at the start and have an easy time of it. I would say get there when the room opens and plan to be bored, plan to spend a lot of time waiting. When I took it previously, it was in Sendai, and so I drove from Fukushima to Sendai, and it was held on a college campus. So it was a very different experience than taking it in the middle of Osaka in a busy neighborhood. And the N5 test wasn't super crowded. It was very clear that the N3 level test had the most test takers in the afternoon, N1 and 2 in the morning. I'd be very curious to see what those look like. But it was very crowded, so know where you're going and plan to give yourself plenty of time, because it's not a cheap test to take and it's definitely not worth wasting the money on it. Apologies for all the atmospheric noise. It's rainy season in Osaka, so you're probably hearing more of the surroundings than you normally would. I think that's probably all I have for now. Going to sit on it a little bit more and see what I think about, but really that was the most striking thing to me, was exactly how rigid it was. They really don't give you any kind of assistance at all in terms of the timing of the test too. The room didn't have a clock, so I would say bring a wristwatch, because you can't use any digital kind of watches, and bring a wristwatch that doesn't make any noise, because if it does make noise you would get a red card and get kicked out. They give red and yellow cards now, which is not something I remember them doing before. But they don't warn you when there's 5 minutes left or 1 minute left. They don't even tell you there's a couple minutes left before the test starts. So I really would recommend bringing some kind of watch that doesn't make any noise, or timepiece that doesn't make any noise, that you can use during the test to keep yourself on pace. I did not have any trouble with the questions, so pace was not something I was really concerned with, but I'm definitely going to be bringing one for subsequent tests, just to kind of make sure that I stay on track, because I do anticipate having problems with upcoming tests. There was actually the listening section is tricky. The listening section, for sure, if you kind of don't have your focus right, you really can get distracted easily and thrown off track. And so there was one question where I wasn't hearing quite the answers that I was expecting, and I don't think that there was a super obvious answer, and I'm a little bit upset about that, and it threw me off for the next question too, so I had to kind of get myself back on track. And then there was one type of question where you don't have to write anything, but they have you arrange a sentence essentially, and those you want to be taking notes on. I realized at some point that, okay, let me just write some things down so that I'm not struggling with this quite as much. But that's all I've got for now. It was a really interesting experience. I'm really glad that I did it. I think I will try and do N4, although when I tried to register last time, N4 was already sold out, so we'll see. I think N4 and N3, there's a huge demand for it, so we'll see if I'm even able to get a seat. But I'll have more probably before and after this little section of the podcast. So those were my immediate reactions to taking the JLPT N5. One thing that I would correct there is I said that it wasn't worth the cost, because it was kind of an expensive test, and I would say it wasn't worth it to go and mess up and get kicked out. It's 7,500 yen, which is, that's enough for me to pay for 3 months worth of cell phone service, or probably a full month worth of bento lunches at work. And that's not money that I would want to throw away. So if you're going to go take the test, take it seriously. I think it may potentially be worth it to take the test. I just meant that it isn't worth throwing your money away. If you're going to do it, go do it seriously, follow all the rules. So I think my thoughts pretty much covered. I think I was just shocked at how strict it was initially, and I didn't really cover too much of the content. I mentioned the 3 sections, and in terms of looking back at the Japanese that you need for N5, you need a full foundation of Japanese. So you need to know distal and direct style for verbs. You need to know how to make all the verb forms very quickly, and you need to know how to read them. You can't be in there in the test um, trying to conjugate verbs very slowly. You need to be able to do that pretty much on a dime. You need to know the past and present for different verbs. You need to know the te form. You need to know all particles, I would say, all the basic particles for Japanese grammar. So, ni, e, wo, wa, ga, those essential ones. Wa, I don't think counts as as a grammatical particle, but you need to know how to use wa, and those you can't you can't be kind of like guessing with those. You need to be able to read full paragraphs and understand context and causality, basic causality, des kara and things like that, da kara, and they'll ask you about that. You need to really have your listening skills down, and I think that's probably the biggest section where you will need to practice and understand the test going into it. Because what they do with the listening section is they'll give you 4 answers, and they'll say all of them over the course of whatever the conversation happens to be. And so you can't just rely on, oh, I heard that one, so that's the answer. No, you need to be able to pick out the meaning from it, because they're going to mention all of them, and you need to kind of expect them to mention all of them. And so if they say they'll often say the correct answer early on in the conversation, and then later on in the conversation say the wrong answers, just to kind of throw you off. You need to be like ready for that. And so when you hear the right answer, note that down, and then kind of continue through the rest of the test saying, okay, now I'm going to be listening for the wrong answers because I know they're coming. And you can just kind of spend that time saying, okay, let me now confirm the wrong answers now that I've got the right answers. In terms of vocabulary level, it's pretty low, I would say. I think it would be relatively easy to find a vocab list somewhere online, or get a textbook and really just hammer out the vocab so that you know them. You need to know them in kanji and in hiragana, and you need to know very similar. You need to know a lot of the lookalikes that are tempting to mistake for each other. I'm trying to think of, none of them come to mind, and I probably wouldn't want to say any in particular, but there'll be a lot of very obvious lookalikes and things like that that you can detect from the basic vocab lists. So if I would say, kind of big picture thinking, the JLPT N5 is really designed for somebody who's done maybe like a year of Japanese study, or, at most 2 years. I think once 2 years, I kind of have the sense that 2-3 years, you want to start looking at N4, N3 level. And anything before that, maybe N5. Whether or not you take it, I would say, is a question of like what it means for you. Like, is it a motivational thing? I don't know if there are any kind of businesses or anything like that value having in 5, to be honest. Judging from the people who are at the test, in 3 clearly has some kind of significant meaning for people, because it, I, judging from the people who were taking the test, it was a lot of it seemed like students who were in Japanese classes, uh, and actually some of the teachers were there, in seeing them off in the line, wishing them good luck, which I thought was really nice. And so clearly they were taking courses that were designed to kind of get them somewhere. And I would imagine that might be baito level work or something like that in Japan. Maybe that's the important an important level for that. In 3 might be an important level for getting baito or something like that in Japan. In 5, I don't think has that same cachet, but I would say, you know, if I were a hiring manager, it would mean something different for me now that I've taken the test from before. I think before I expected it to just be kind of a nothing test, but now I understand that, okay, this is somebody who has committed a certain level of time and energy to their Japanese studies and is able to do Japanese, which I think is impressive in its own right. So if N5 for you is something that's worth taking, then I would say go for it. I'd say, especially if it's a motivational factor that's going to kind of keep you focused, keep you studying, that I think is worth it. If you're someone who's already been studying and you're kind of a tweener, I would say push yourself and go for N4 or N3 if you can at this point. It might be you might be better off doing that. And but if you're just getting started, maybe N5 is a good kind of reward. I hate to call it a reward, but something that you can kind of like set your sights on if you're just getting started, and even maybe put a time limit on a goal of getting your Japanese more fluent. That's all I've got on the JLPT. Let me know if you have any specific questions about the JLPT. My email address is howtojapanese@gmail.com. I'm glad to answer questions about it. Now to our normal podcast. The agenda is basically what it always is. I will go over my newsletter this month, have a few Ito points, and then a recommendation, this time in Kyoto. So this month in the newsletter, I went a little bit meta and I looked at the how rather than the what, which is, I think, a constant tension in my writing, and I think a lot of writing about studying Japanese, especially out there on the internet these days, and also not just writing, but also like short form video and things like that. I think often people want to focus on telling students how they should be studying Japanese rather than actually what they should be studying, not what they should be studying, but also the what of specific Japanese grammar points, right? So last month we looked at Tadakereba Saiwai, this very specific point that you all can kind of take home and implement into your own Japanese. I think that's kind of what I want to be focusing on at How to Japanese, in terms of giving you all content that you can take away to make your Japanese more fluent, or that kind of like open up Japanese and help you understand it a little bit better. But I think it also is important to think about the how every now and then, I think, because it's tempting to spend too much time doing it, I think. And this is true for any pursuit or hobby or anything, right? Whether it's brewing beer at home, or building a computer, or learning how to smoke meat at home or something like that. You could read forever about how to do it, what to buy, how much money you need to do it, right? For studying Japanese, you could think about, okay, how many flashcards? What's the ideal flashcard number? What book should I be reading? And you could spend too much time thinking about what study materials you need. Or you could spend time thinking about, okay, where in Japan should I go if I want to be studying? And that can end up consuming you and distracting students from doing the actual work of studying. So I think in general, when you're making a study plan, you need to pick something quickly and then just like start putting it into action immediately and consistently. Um, and then periodically, though, review that and see how it's going and do a kind of um, assessment of your process. And so that's what I wanted to do this month a little bit. Think about a little bit about the how, although I do have a little bit of what too. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I've been doing these US JETA Japanese coaching sessions. And with that, what we do is essentially just kind of talk with a few students and see what they're running into, like what challenges they're having, where do they need help, what is their current study plan, and is there anything we can do to kind of adjust that. And then the question that always comes up, I think, is the reason why this question comes up is because these are all people who are adults. They're out of that kind of college experience. College is a special kind of 4-year time for you to kind of do anything you want. And if you can do Japanese during those 4 years, I would really advise it, because it is incredible to do only Japanese if that's what you end up focusing on, or for Japanese to be like, even if you're doing some other kind of major, if Japanese can be 10, 15%, 20% of what you're doing, because once you graduate and get into a working situation, finding that percentage of your time to spend on any one thing other than work and then just kind of surviving, I think is a difficult task. And that's what people in these coaching sessions find, is that how, as an adult with like a million other obligations, do I spend time studying Japanese and do it effectively? And I have a little bit of experience kind of doing that same thing, obviously, because I went back to the US for grad school and then worked for a long time. Some of that work was Japan and Japanese adjacent work, which helped. But a lot of it was just kind of sheer force of will, making sure I was doing the kind of Japanese work that I wanted to be doing outside of my day job. And in terms of, when I say Japanese work, like Japanese study work, reading Japanese, practicing Japanese, writing about Japanese, things like that. And I also recently went through a major life change. Longtime readers and listeners will know that I was on paternity leave at the beginning of this year, and so we have a young daughter, and so that's obviously meant that I have far less time to do really anything, especially if it's stuff on my own. And for example, right now I've been recording this at like 6:30 in the morning, when my wife and daughter are asleep. So that's when I can fit it in. And I think that's true with Japanese study. You just kind of have to do it. You have to do something. You have to do it every day, and it must be somewhat substantial and push you in the right direction towards fluency. And part of this is kind of like knowing yourself, knowing your natural tendencies rather than fighting against them. For me, that means going to bed early and getting up early so I have this time in the morning. And I'm just a morning person. My wife, on the other hand, is a night owl and likes to stay up. And so actually it works pretty well together, because she can do some of the night stuff, and then I'll get up early with the baby sometimes, and then I'll get lucky some days when the baby sleeps in. And you also need to know where you are in your studies, right? Like the earlier you are in your studies, the more consistent and substantial each daily kind of push has to be. If you're just getting started with hiragana, it's not something you can do one hiragana a week or a month, right? You need to like sit down and make a substantial push to get through those initial barriers keeping you away from accessing the language. Once you're into the language a little bit more, each daily push doesn't need to be quite so substantial, but I think it can be benefit from being consistent. And so right sizing your goals is kind of what I talked about this month in the newsletter, and I gave an example of setting a goal. And during my paternity leave, I knew that I was going to be extremely busy and really not have much time to do anything. And so I said, well, I kind of like taken care of the newsletter and some of the podcast stuff beforehand, or at least the newsletter, and I thought I could knock out the podcast quickly. And so what I did is I said, okay, I want to read a novel, Child of Fortune by Tsushima Yuko. I think it's Choji in Japanese, and I want to read it bilingually in Japanese and English during my 3 months of leave. The novel is 161 pages in English. And so if I read that at 2 pages a day, so I read 2 pages in English and the equivalent amount in Japanese, that would have given me a buffer of 10 days. And it actually ended up being a perfectly right-sized goal. So I track some of my reading in one, not Goodreads, but I can't remember the name of the app right now, but I track the reading there. And so I started it on December 9th, which was, I think, literally the day, I think I started, I think my last day at work was December 5th, but the first day off was December 8th, and then 9th was a Tuesday probably. So I started that day pretty quickly into my leave, and then I finished on March 1st, which that's 82 days, like just under my pace. And I must have missed a few days here and there, but it didn't kind of set me off of my goal. And so doing something like that, saying, okay, I have a goal, I have a certain goal that I need to meet by a certain time, and it feels like a reasonable goal, right? You need to make sure that it's not like, okay, I need to do all 2,000 kanji by the end of the next 3 months. That's not right sizing a goal. So for in 5, I think there are like 100, 200 kanji. So if that's something that you could really try and master within, I think, 6 months to a year, I think you'd be doing yourself a favor. And then you can check in, make maybe even an appointment in your calendar to check in on how the goal is going. So if you set a goal for 3 months, say, okay, I'm going to check in once a month. So after 1 month, you see how you're going, feel if you need to adjust. But when you're in the thick of it, just every day, you shouldn't be thinking about that goal. You just have to kind of put your head down and do it, and then reassess later. Take a breath, come up for air, get a big picture view later. And that's really what's worked for me, I think. And interestingly enough, I wanted to share at least one passage from Choji, from Child of Fortune. And one of the interesting things I found was tsuzuku and tsuzukeru, the two verbs that both mean continue, on the same page. And so I thought that was interesting. And also both used as compound verbs, so connected with other verbs. And so these are like long, kind of wordy passages. But let me see if I can read these. Okay, here's the first passage. その自分本位な気持ちに我ながら呆れた。かや子を取られたくない。奪われたくない。それからの日々はこの思いだけに支えられ、高校は畑中に優しい言葉を向け続けていた。So that last phrase has the tsuzukeru in the form of 向け続けていた。向け続けていた。So continued to mukeru, which is such an interesting verb in Japanese. It's tough to translate because it literally means something like point towards, direct towards, and in this case, yasashi kotoba o muke tsuzukete ita. So koko is directing kind words towards Hatanaka. And here is the official translation. Though she was shocked at her selfishness, one thought, that she wouldn't part with Kayako, was all that gave Koko the strength to go on speaking civilly to Hatanaka. And it's interesting because the translation there disguises the tsuzukeru completely. It doesn't need to be translated literally, which I think is an interesting choice, and I think probably a good choice, and I think instructive to aspiring translators. And we'll see the same thing actually in the Tsuzuku passage. Here's the Tsuzuku passage. しばらく窓際で浅い雪に覆われた街路を眺めてから急いで着替えを済ませ、牛乳を喉に流し込んで外に駆け出た。ボタン雪が空からの塊のように降り続いていた。So in this case, 続いていた is connected to 降る, the verb to fall, 降り続いていた. So the ボタン雪が降り続いていた. This snow was continuing to fall. And here the official translation is, they stayed by the window to gaze at the powdered street. Then they dressed quickly, drank down glasses of milk, and ran outside. Large flakes were drifting steadily from the sky like balls of lint. And again, the tsuzuku in this case is disguised as drifting steadily down, which I think is a really nice way to render it in English. Something for translators to consider. And I don't have many comments on the tadoshi jidoshi distinction yet because I haven't quite formulated what I want to say about it, and I'm working on another newsletter about it. And I think that will be in September. We'll see if I can get through it because I have some interesting thoughts on jidoshi and tadoshi, which is an interesting impossible pair in my mind. But for me, jidoshi and tadoshi are actually very distinct. I guess it just clicked at some point. But intransitive and transitive, on the other hand, I think for me are not. And so if anybody has mnemonic for those or has a way of remembering those, let me know because I'm very curious. And I think what I'll be writing about in September is that distinction and the difference between jidoshi and tadoshi and intransitive and transitive, because they're, I would say, not exactly equivalent, I don't think, in a lot of cases. But yeah, that was an interesting little item that I noticed while I was reading, and that's something you can do while you're reading. That's one thing I also emphasize to U.S. Japanese coaching participants is that you need to be an active consumer of Japanese, whether that means while you're watching anime or listening to a podcast or reading. I don't think it's enough to just sit there and take it in. And I'm guilty of this as anyone. So I can't really, I'm not kind of, hopefully not saying this condescendingly, but you need to kind of actively be involved in that consumption. And you can do that by taking notes somehow, finding little passages, finding sentence structures that you think you can reuse. Being a collector, I think I've called it in the past. Yes, I just did a quick review of my past writing, and in February 2025, I wrote about this, how it can be beneficial to be an avid collector of Japanese, and that was the month that I introduced the phrase "ato ni natte wakatta koto da ga," which is a great phrase that I found from one of Murakami's essays, and have not put into practice yet, but have definitely filed it away as something that I think would be extremely useful phrase to express, oh, this is something I learned later, but, and so things like that, if you notice something, whether, it's like this phrase that you'd like to try and use, or a vocab word, or even just like something like this that I found, which is the tsuzukeru and tsuzuku on the same page, used both in compound verbs. Things like that, if you can kind of like keep track of those, whether it's in a flashcard system or something, I do think that's going to be extremely beneficial for you while you're studying. So that's really all I have with the newsletter, to be honest. Tsuzuku is also, I think, an apt word to use for the newsletter in general because of the great phrase keizoku wa chikara nari. Keizoku wa chikara nari. And for those of you who have been studying Japanese for a while, keizoku, the zoku there, you'll recognize as tsuzuku. That's another great phenomenon that I've written about how sounds will take on these meanings in Japanese once you study long enough. Even a word like zoku has all these different meanings, one of them being continue. And this keizoku, kei being the kei from tsugu, I believe. Yes, I just double checked, and it's tsugu, which is to inherit or succeed or something like that, combined with the zoku from Suzuku, keizoku, or I always like to translate it as persistence. Wa chikara nari. Persistence is power. And that's true with a Japanese study plan, I think, more than anywhere else. And do what you have to do to maintain that keizoku. If that means really shedding anything else, and for me, that's meant shedding video games. To be honest, drinking to a great extent has really just disappeared from my life. And uh, that will leave what is important, and that will leave what you value, and that choice of what you decide to leave and what remains, that's a value judgment on your but that you will make. And and that's how you know that I think Japanese is important to you, is if you're able to make that decision and keep it going. And then every now and then check in on your plan. Check in on how you're doing. Now might be a good time to do it since we just hit halfway through the year. See if there's any adjustments that you need to make. And then check in at the end of the year. Give yourself a break around New Year's, as we do in Japan. I'm already looking forward to it. Already looking forward to September, actually, which we have a nice long weekend then as well. But that would also be an excellent time to check in a couple months. But until then, just keep your head down and keep going. And I think you'll eventually get to where you want to go. For the Iro, I didn't have too much this month. Just a small note that I haven't put my podcast review of Murakami's new novel together just yet. I have a review online for the serialized version, in which I gave some summaries of what the stories are about and some thoughts on what Murakami's doing and the quality. Spoiler alert, not good. And then I also guessed what he might do with the hardcover version, and I was mostly wrong. And I'll go over that in a review because Murakami doesn't really do anything. And that was one thing that I said maybe he could do that, because I guess the end of the last story is an ending of sorts, but it also felt somewhat open. But yeah, I'll get into that on the full Murakami review episode. And so if anybody is not interested in Murakami, please do feel free to skip that. I also linked to an interesting article on the ice cream cartel in Japan. Apparently, there are the four big companies are being investigated for price fixing, and so I'm hoping that means the price of ice cream, real ice cream in particular, will drop at some point. I don't know if there's any reason to be optimistic about that. And then the last link that I included was a link to the reading for this month's Japanese reading group. It's to an essay called Kohi Iro no Kaiso, Coffee Colored Recollections by Akagawa Jiro. And I have to shout out Brad Rice, who recommended this way back in 2009. He didn't recommend this particular essay, but he recommended Akagawa Jiro's work, specifically Shiroi Ame, whom a teacher had recommended to him. So Brad Rice, I think, founded Japanator, a long time Japanese culture blog that is, I think, maybe not defunct, but I think maybe he sold it. But so yeah, that was a comment on my blog from 2009, and I included a link to that, I think, in the newsletter this month, and that got me thinking about Akagawa Jiro. So I did some digging, looking for essays online from him, and he has one at the Zen Nihon Kohi Kyokai. So I wonder what the official translation of that is. Let's see. It's the All Japan Coffee Association. And for whatever reason, they commissioned an essay by Akagawa Jiro, which seems really interesting. Perfect little length, nice and short. And it starts about how all the characters in his books are always at kisaten, and Akagawa notes that that's likely because he himself doesn't drink, and so his characters also then don't drink. And so I guess that's probably one of the reasons why they commissioned him in particular to write this essay, is I guess because a lot of his works are kind of associated with these kisaten coffee shops. So yeah, it looks like a really nice little read. I'm always on the hunt for essays like that that we can use for the reading group. So if you know of any or any other good writers, please do feel free to send them my way. One last very random Iro note. I heard from one reader last month after I wrote about Yahoo Chiebukuro, and they said that their experience also matches my own in terms of not being able to register a Yahoo account. I mentioned last month that my Yahoo email address was mysteriously deactivated, even though I don't really think I violated any terms of service. It's one that I had registered in 2023. I have messages left in my phone that were SMS messages that I received upon registering that email address, and that I used as the two-factor authentication essentially. And I guess I had just registered it maybe to get to Yahoo Chiebukuro or some other service that Yahoo runs. And I guess I just hadn't used it at all. And I went to try and log in to Yahoo Chiebukuro and it wouldn't let me. And when I tried to create a new Yahoo email account, it said that my phone number had been banned or something like that. So this reader also said that their experience, they weren't able to register because their computer was set in English, or they were in a different country or something like that, and they suspected that potentially it was to get around GDPR. I think that's the acronym, regulations in Europe that are very strict in terms of privacy, and also things like one click unsubscribe, things like that. I don't know. They were very curious to know somebody who works at Yahoo to get a little bit more info. So if you are somebody who works at Yahoo or know somebody who works at Yahoo in Japan, please do let us know. Very curious to see why things are set up the way they are to be so difficult for us here in Japan. And my recommendation for this month is Arashiyama in Kyoto. I visited for the first time last month, and so now I kind of finally know what everything's about. I had somehow missed it every other visit to Kyoto over the last 24 years. I don't know why, to be honest. I think maybe because it really only got super popular recently as a kind of Instagram location with the bamboo forest and things like that, the bridge, Togetsukyo Bridge. And I don't know why. I feel like it wasn't on my radar 20 years ago when I first got here, like other things were, obviously the Temple of the Golden Pavilion, Ginkakuji, things like that, Nijojo. But now it's clearly a destination. It is overrun with tourists. And despite that, I guess I can recommend it and recommend a visit. I would say, depending on what you're looking for, one of the best approaches would be to go super early in the morning when no one is there and just check it out, have a look, see Tenryuji, which is the great temple there that's set in or near the bamboo forest. So what you can do is walk across the bridge, assuming you're coming from the Hankyu line station, walk across the bridge, Togetsukyo, walk along the kind of main street that's overrun with touristy locations that have like matcha ice cream and other things for tourists essentially. Take a left through the bamboo grove. At the end of the bamboo grove, take another left through the back entrance of Tenryuji, and then walk through to the front of Tenryuji, and that will put you back out onto the main street, and you can circle back around to the train stations. And if you're not coming from Hankyu, I guess that would probably put you on the same side of the bridge as Tenryuji. So you could still do the same circle through the bamboo grove, through Tenryuji back to the main avenue, except you probably want to go down to the bridge to get a view of that. Togetsukyo is one of the few bridges I think that I feel like is really striking in Japan and looks like those old ukiyo-e prints where you see those giant arching bridges covered with people selling things and kind of markets on either side of the bridge from old ukiyo-e of Edo in particular, I think. And for me, I don't know. You never see locations like that except Togetsukyo. I feel like maybe is like the perfect distance to in terms of the water to be spanned by a bridge like that. Anything bigger than that would be just a tremendous upkeep for a wooden picturesque bridge like that. Um, that was great. We missed the monkey park, but friends said it was good and that you can get quite close to the monkeys. And I would just escape after that, to be honest. Like, if you can get away without eating there, that would be best just because it's everything's going to be priced up. Uh, but I'm sure that the food is fine everywhere, to be honest. I would say we ate on the Hankyu side of the bridge, and that was far calmer. There's a set of maybe like 3 or 4 locations, like an udon spot, and a couple other places uh, closer to the Hankyu side on the opposite side of Togetsukyo from the bamboo grove. And it was far more relaxed, less people, less busy than the other side, which puts you on sidewalks that are narrow, lots of people walking, and maybe spots that are difficult to figure out where to go. If you are going to eat somewhere or sit down somewhere on the Tenuji side of the river, the one place we ended up at was this little kind of open air shopping mall slash food court called Arashiyama Shoryuen. And it was perfect for families, I would say, if you're there with kids, because it's this open space you go through, and then there are kind of little food stalls and omiyage shops. And then if you go through and to the left, there's benches you can sit on, and so you can go and grab some skewers of meat or a beer or a soft serve ice cream or a parfait or something like that, and then go sit on the benches. And I mean, the food was really nothing to write home about. I don't think the parfaits were pricey, just like everything in that area, but they looked really good. Beer was fine; it was super dry, and that was nice enough. You know, it's not something I would have done unless we weren't burdened with at that time 5 kids between all of the families there, and it was hot and we needed somewhere to kind of sit down after the temple. So I can recommend Arashiyama Shoryuen as a nice place to kind of sit down for not much of a cost. So if you factor that in terms of like if there's not going to be lines like somewhere else, you're more likely to get a place to sit down, unlike other places, and it won't cost you too much. Like if you just buy a beer or a water or something like that, and then you find a bench to sit on, it that could be something else that I could recommend. But so yeah, other than that, I would say get in, get out, take a look, see it. It's not something that I would dig too deep on, although there is the Fukuda Art Museum, which I think comes somewhat recommended if you're looking to do a little bit more. That might be something to add to your itinerary, depending on what's on exhibit. And that's all for this month. Hope you all are keeping cool. I have to say that my prediction about it getting warm in June was wrong. I think we had a really nice long rainy season this year that kept things really chilly, even if it was a little damp. And we only really got super hot in the last couple weeks, but now it's pretty miserable. So hope you all are keeping cool somehow, and we'll see you in August.